October 24th, 1910. Advance teams of the English polar expedition headed out to stockpile additional supplies. Robert Scott's main party followed on the 1st of November. The transportation logistics of Scott's plan soon began to fall apart.
The motorized sledges broke down very quickly. Unfortunately, they hadn't yet got engines which were reliable at low temperatures. There was a dog team zipping around, moving embarrassingly fast and really demonstrating that they should all be traveling with dog teams.
In contrast, Scott's Siberian ponies proved ill-suited to the climate as they struggled in the heavy snow.
It was a very bad plan to bring them in the first place. Their coats were much too thin for the temperatures. They quickly became emaciated and they died, and Scott felt as if he was drowning kittens daily.
December 9, we have camped and the ponies have been shot. Poor beasts. They've done wonderfully well considering the terrible circumstances.
Even after the loss of the motorized sledges and the ponies, Scott sent the dog teams back to the base camp as he had originally planned.
He was never convinced that dogs could be pushed up a glacier or could be used to take him across the polar plateau to the pole. Scott and his men who went forward were reliant purely on their own efforts, man-hauling sledges that weighed 700 pounds apiece.
The men began to climb through the ice falls of the Beardmore Glacier, following the route that Ernest Schackelton had pioneered in 1908. The Beardmore Glacier opened upon the vast windswept polar plateau. Reaching 10,000 feet above sea level, it is the coldest place on Earth. Temperatures can drop to minus 126 degrees Fahrenheit. As the 5 men of the polar party began their final push, temperatures ranged from a balmy daytime measurement of 26 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 10 degrees at night.
The explorers were wet through almost all the time. They were wearing canvas outfits, unlike the furs that Amundsen was using, and it didn't wick sweat away from their skins at all. So their outfits froze solid during the nights, and when they put them on in the morning, they would melt on their skin, so they were constantly damp.
This afternoon, we got about 10 minutes of snow, which was like breaking through a glass house at each step. Most of us are using goggles with glass of light green tint. We find this color very grateful to the eyes.
With each man harnessed to the sledge, they averaged from 5 to 13 miles a day. They were expending more calories than they were taking in. Slowly, hour by hour, their strength began to ebb. By the time Scott passed Ernest Schackelton's farthest south, the men were showing signs of scurvy. Step by step, pulling their heavy load, the 5 men marched on over the hypnotic landscape. As they neared the South Pole, their weary spirits lifted.
It was Birdie Bowers who spotted what looked like a small black speck on the horizon, and he thought first of all that it was some sort of natural formation. But of course, as they got closer, the horrible truth became inescapable. What they'd actually been looking at was a flag, which had been left as a marker by Amundsen and his Norwegian party.
The date was January 16th, 1911. Scott and his men had traveled over 800 miles in 78 days, only to discover that Amundsen had already captured their prize. For Scott, it was pain almost beyond reason.
We have had a horrible day. Great God. This is an awful place, and terrible enough for us to have labored to it without the reward of priority.
Scott and his men could only guess at the events which had brought the Norwegians to victory. October 20th, 1911. The Great Ice Barrier, Antarctica. Determined to beat Robert Scott to the pole, Roald Amundsen struck out for the 2nd time. Amundsen didn't know that he was leaving 11 days before the Englishman. giving him an advantage from the start. Even with dogs pulling the sledges, going was slow due to high winds and heavy snows. Unlike Scott, walking in the boot prints of his former colleague Ernest Schackelton, Amundsen was forging a new route through unexplored terrain.
Everything was a mystery. So that meant, for the last nearly 500 miles, he was a combination of an Olympic ski racer and an explorer in completely unknown territory.
After threading his way through the ice falls of the Axel Heiberg Glacier, Amundsen reached the Antarctic Plateau. Here, at the place he dubbed the butcher shop, the weakest dogs were killed and fed to the hungry survivors. From there, Amundsen's trek proceeded with an almost arrogant efficiency. With his combined use of cross-country skis and sledge dogs, his teams averaged 15 miles a day. A brilliant sun blazed overhead when the navigators signaled them to stop. 360 degrees of unbroken whiteness declared the truth. They were the first men to reach the South Pole. The date was December 15th, 1911. Scott and his men wouldn't arrive here for another 35 days. Amundsen asked each of his 4 teammates to place a hand on the staff as he drove the Norwegian flag into the ice.
It was the only way I could show my companions my gratitude here at this desolate and forlorn place.
Amundsen's men were in such good spirits that they gleefully raced each other as they headed back across the Arctic plateau. By January 30th, they were on board the Fram, steaming through the ice toward civilization and glory. Word of Amundsen's victory hit newsstands all over the world. In Norway, he was exalted in the press, although some were uneasy with this triumph at the expense of their British friends.
It was felt that he had been dishonest. This hurt him, I think, at one level, but at another level, he didn't care. The main thing, he had attained what he'd set out to in the manner in which he had proposed.
When Amundsen began his first lecture tour in Australia and New Zealand, no one had yet heard from Robert Scott or the Terra Nova. January 16th, 1911. After a difficult journey to reach the South Pole, Captain Robert Scott and his 4 companions planted the British flag 35 days after Roald Amundsen had claimed the prize for Norway. The Englishmen had no energy to hide their disappointment.
If you look at the photograph which they took of themselves at the pole, these 5 weary men who'd struggled so far and been through so much, you can see the defeat in their faces, their expression. There's no light, there's no joy.
Their spirits broken, they now faced a return trek of over 800 miles. Their bodies, overtaxed and malnourished, were already breaking down. The robust Welshman, Edgar Evans, succumbed first.
He just really dropped out of the party and they found him wandering, later lying in the snow. It was a terrible psychological blow. Edgar Evans had died and they had to turn their backs on him and go on without him.
The 4 remaining men inched down the Beardmore Glacier and reached the Great Ice Barrier. They still had hundreds of miles to travel, but food and fuel were running low. Frostbite was ravaging their hands and feet, making it difficult to walk. The right foot of Army Captain Titus Oates was so completely frozen that he cut a hole in a sleeping bag, preferring to leave it exposed to the elements rather than endure the pain of thawing. By Saturday, March 17th, he had lost all hope of surviving. Scott recorded his final moments.
He was a brave soul. It was blowing a blizzard. He said, "I'm just going outside and may be some time." We've not seen him since.
Robert Scott, Edward Wilson and Bertie Bowers managed to press ahead a few more miles before a blizzard trapped them in their tent. With no fuel and no food, they began writing farewell letters to loved ones back home. It was Scott who wrote the most and the longest.
He wrote funeral music in words for the expedition. He made it seem as if a huge, invisible, somber orchestra were playing them off the stage of history.
On March 29th, Captain Robert Falcon Scott managed one last entry in his journal.
Outside the swirl of the tent remains a scene of whirling drift. I do not think we can hope for better things now. We shall stick it out to the end, but we are getting weaker, of course, and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more. Ah, Scott, for God's sake, look after our people.
Nine months passed before a search party from Terra Nova located a small mound covered with snow. It was Scott's tent. Inside lay the frozen bodies of their comrades. They had died less than 11 miles away from One Ton Depot, a life-saving cache of food.
For me, really one of the most compelling parts of the whole story is not that Scott and his men failed, but that they so very nearly succeeded.
The grief-stricken survivors collected the letters and journals, then collapsed the tent over the dead men's bodies. They erected a stone monument to mark the grave. Flags around the world were lowered to half-mast as news of the catastrophe spread. In England, thousands of mourners filled St. Paul's Cathedral for a memorial service. Money poured in for the family members of the deceased. With war looming in Europe, the images of Scott and his dead companions were held up as heroic examples of the consummate British male. Scott's final words had accomplished the writer's mission.
Those are words with an incredible power to spread. Virtually everybody on the planet who read the newspapers in 1913 knew what Oates's final words had been when he stepped out into the snow. They were global celebrities.
Roald Amundsen was lecturing in America when he received word of Scott's death.
It was a terrible shock to him. It was totally unexpected. He was never in Scott's shadow as long as Scott appeared to be alive. But when Scott died, it drove him to the edge of sanity.
Amundsen remained active in polar exploration. In 1926, he joined an Italian, Umberto Nobile, for another historic polar expedition.
He flew in an airship across the Arctic Ocean and past the North Pole, therefore becoming the first man indisputably to have passed the North Pole, and certainly the first man ever to have reached both poles of the Earth.
In May of 1928, when the Italian's airship crashed during another Arctic flight, Amundsen rushed to join the massive search effort. On June 18, 1928, he took off in a small plane and headed north out over the ice. The 55-year-old polar legend was never seen again.
Amundsen, in my view, was the greatest polar explorer, bar none. He was an artist. He was an artist in action.
The untimely passing of Robert Scott and his men marked the end of an era. The North and South Poles were no longer mysteries. For the most part, the surface of the Earth was mapped.
I think that with Scott's death, something else died, which was the idea that nature was there to be conquered. We don't see it as a huge thing which might crush us, which we must nobly fight against. I think we see it linked to the rest of the planet much more now.
Today, men and women still struggle each year to reach the ends of the Earth. Only now there are satellites tracking their positions. In Antarctica, an isolated scientific station marks the spot where Amundsen first staked the Norwegian flag. The North Pole and the South, two geographic prizes to which men assigned the inestimable value of honor, of reputation, of human life. Were the prizes worth the price?
The search for the North Pole especially was an exercise in futility. What does it prove? What do you learn from finding the North Pole except that you had a hell of a long walk, you know? There's nothing there.
Perhaps we have lost our ability to appreciate achievement without decrying the motive behind the deed. No man moves without ambition. No great man excels without a dream. The struggle to reach the poles was the culmination of centuries of exploration. Peary, Cook, Amundsen, and Scott had gone where other men could only dream. The prospect of adventure and a desire for glory had driven them out into the cold. These two empty stretches of ice merely provided the stage for their immortal race into history.
The motorized sledges break down very quickly. Unfortunately, they hadn't yet got engines which were reliable at low temperatures. There was a dog team zipping around, moving embarrassingly fast and really demonstrating that they should all be traveling with dog teams.
In contrast, Scott's Siberian ponies proved ill-suited to the climate as they struggled in the heavy snow.
It was a very bad plan to bring them in the first place. Their coats were much too thin for the temperatures. They quickly became emaciated and they died, and Scott felt as if he was drowning kittens daily.
December 9, we have camped and the ponies have been shot. Poor beasts. They have done wonderfully well considering the terrible circumstances.
Even after the loss of the motorized sledges and the ponies, Scott sent the dog teams back to the base camp as he had originally planned.
He was never convinced that dogs could be pushed up a glacier or could be used to take him across the polar plateau to the pole. Scott and his men who went forward were reliant purely on their own efforts, man-hauling sledges that weighed 700 pounds apiece.
The men began to climb through the ice falls of the Beardmore Glacier, following the route that Ernest Schackelton had pioneered in 1908. October 24th, 1910. Advance teams of the English polar expedition headed out to stockpile additional supplies. Robert Scott's main party followed on the 1st of November. The transportation logistics of Scott's plan soon began to fall.